April 17, 1934, 2:47 p.m. Judge Harold Iron Will Morrison brought his gavel down with the finality of thunder, his voice echoing through the packed Chicago courtroom as he delivered the words that should have ended. Al Capone's reign forever. Alphonse Capone. You are hereby sentenced to death by electric chair, execution to be carried out within 30 days. The courtroom erupted in chaos, reporters scrambled for phones, and federal agents smiled with satisfaction at finally bringing down America's most powerful criminal. But Al Capone just sat calmly at the defendant's table, checking his pocket watch and smiling that trademark calm smile that had made hardened criminals nervous for decades. At exactly 3:17 p.m., 30 minutes after Judge Morrison's death sentence, the bailiff discovered the judge's chambers empty, the window open, and no trace of the man who had just condemned Al Capone to die. Judge Morrison had vanished from a courthouse surrounded by federal agents, Chicago police, and court security, disappearing so completely that even his body was never found. What happened in those 30 minutes would prove that Al Capone's reach extended far beyond the criminal underworld. It reached into the very heart of America's legal system itself. What made Judge Morrison's disappearance the most chilling demonstration of Al Capone's power wasn't just that a federal judge had vanished from a secure courthouse. It was that Al Capone had been sitting in shackles, surrounded by guards with no apparent way to communicate with the outside world when it happened. To understand how Al Capone made a federal judge disappear in 30 minutes, you need to understand something that even the FBI didn't fully grasp at the time. Al's organization wasn't just a criminal enterprise that operated outside the law. It was a shadow government that had infiltrated every level of Chicago's legal and political system so completely that Al could orchestrate complex operations while sitting in a defendant's chair. Judge Harold Morrison thought he was sentencing a criminal. Actually, he was signing his own disappearance warrant, because Al Capone had been planning the judge's elimination for 6 months, waiting for exactly the moment when Morrison would overreach his authority and provide Al with the perfect justification for his removal. But Al's plan wasn't just about eliminating one troublesome judge. It was about sending a message to every judge, prosecutor, and federal agent in America. The legal system could put Al Capone on trial, but it couldn't put him in the electric chair, because Al Capone had something more powerful than any law. He had absolute control over the people who enforced those laws. December 8, 1933, 4 months before the trial, Al Capone received intelligence that would set in motion the most audacious attack on the American legal system in criminal history. Judge Harold Morrison, known for his harsh sentences and incorruptible reputation, had been specifically requested by federal prosecutors to preside over Al's upcoming racketeering trial. Frank Nitti placed the judge's file on Al's desk during their weekly strategy meeting. "Boss, this Morrison's got a reputation. 23 years on the bench, never been bought, never been intimidated. The federals think he's their secret weapon." Al studied Morrison's photograph and background information with the attention he gave to all potential threats. "Every man has weaknesses, Frank. What's Morrison's?" "His daughter Sarah. She's a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. Works the night shift. Single, 26 years old, lives alone on Maple Street." Al continued reading the file, noting Morrison's daily routines, his wife's charity work, his son's law practice, his grandchildren's school schedules. What about financial pressure? Gambling debts? Affairs? Clean as a whistle, boss. Morrison's exactly what he appears to be, an honest judge who can't be bought. Al set down the file and walked to his office window, looking out at the Chicago skyline while his mind worked through the strategic possibilities. "Frank," Al said finally, "there's something you need to understand about honest men. They're not harder to destroy than corrupt men. They're easier to destroy because they never see the attack coming. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to make Judge Morrison disappear. Not today, not next week, but 30 minutes after he sentences me to death. I want every judge in America to understand that condemning Al Capone isn't just dangerous, it's impossible." January 15, 1934. 3 months before the trial, Al began implementing what he privately called Operation Gavel, the most complex judicial manipulation in American criminal history. The plan required precise timing, multiple contingencies, and the cooperation of people Morrison trusted completely. The key, Al explained to his inner circle, isn't corrupting Morrison directly, it's controlling everyone around him without him realizing it. His bailiff, his court reporter, his security detail, his driver. By the time Morrison realizes he's surrounded by my people, it'll be too late for him to do anything about it. Tony Accardo studied the courthouse blueprints that Al's team had acquired. "Boss, how do we get inside information on Morrison's trial strategy?" "We don't need inside information on his strategy," Al replied. "We already know what Morrison's going to do. He's going to sentence me to death because that's what honest judges do when they think they're dealing with irredeemable criminals. Our job isn't to change his mind. Our job is to make sure his decision has consequences he never anticipated." February 28, 1934, 6 weeks before the trial, Al's infiltration of Morrison's world was so complete that the judge was surrounded by Al's agents without having any idea his security had been compromised. Morrison's new bailiff was on Al's payroll, his driver worked for Al's organization, even his court stenographer was feeding information to Al's intelligence network. But Al's most valuable asset was Dr. Patricia Williams, the physician who had been treating Morrison's wife for heart problems. Williams owed Al a substantial favor after Al had arranged for her gambling debts to disappear, and she had been slowly building a relationship of trust with the Morrison family. "The beauty of this operation," Al told Frank Nitti, "is that Morrison will never suspect he's being set up. From his perspective, he's just doing his job, surrounded by people he trusts, making decisions based on evidence and law. He has no idea that every person he relies on is actually working for me. What happens if Morrison doesn't sentence you to death? What if he goes with life imprisonment?" Al smiled, that calm smile that made even his allies uncomfortable. "He'll sentence me to death, Frank, because I'm going to make sure the evidence presented at trial is so overwhelming that an honest judge like Morrison will believe he has no choice but to impose the ultimate penalty." March 20th, 1934, 4 weeks before the trial, Al began the final phase of his plan by ensuring that his trial would unfold exactly as he wanted it to unfold. The federal prosecutors, believing they had an airtight case, had no idea that key pieces of their evidence had been subtly altered to make Al appear even more dangerous and irredeemable than he actually was. "I want Morrison to believe that I'm not just a criminal," Al explained to his legal team. "I want him to believe that I'm a monster who poses such a threat to society that execution is the only possible response." Al's lawyers looked confused. "Boss, why would we want to make the case against you stronger?" "Because," Al replied, "when Morrison sentences me to death based on evidence that I allowed him to see, his decision won't be justice, it'll be manipulation. And when Morrison realizes that he's been manipulated into ordering the execution of a man who played him like a chess piece, his confidence in his own judgment will be so shattered that he'll never again be able to function as a judge." April 17, 1934. The day of sentencing. Al Capone sat in the defendant's chair, surrounded by federal agents, handcuffed and shackled, as Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence that would determine Al's fate. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials and spectators who had come to witness the final chapter in Al Capone's criminal career. "The evidence in this case," Judge Morrison said, addressing the packed courtroom, "demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant has engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior so extensive and so violent that it poses a fundamental threat to the fabric of American society." Al listened calmly as Morrison recited the evidence against him: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, corruption of public officials. Evidence that was accurate but had been carefully curated to present the most damning possible picture of Al's activities. "In my 23 years on the bench," Morrison continued, "I have never encountered a defendant whose crimes were so extensive or whose threat to public safety was so absolute. The court finds that no penalty short of death would be adequate to address the magnitude of these offenses." At 2:47 p.m., Morrison brought down his gavel and pronounced the words that should have ended Al's life. "Alphonse Capone, you are hereby sentenced to death by electric chair." Al checked his pocket watch. 2:47 p.m. Exactly on schedule. The courtroom erupted in chaos, but Al remained calm, his eyes fixed on Judge Morrison, watching the man who had just condemned him to die. Morrison looked back, expecting to see fear, anger, or desperation in Al's eyes. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Al Capone was smiling. April 17, 1934, 3:17 p.m. Exactly 30 minutes after sentencing Al to death, Judge Morrison's bailiff knocked on the judge's chamber's door for the routine post-sentencing security check. When there was no response, the bailiff used his master key to enter. The chamber was empty. The window was open. Morrison's judicial robes were draped over his chair. His wallet, watch, and wedding ring were arranged neatly on his desk, but Judge Harold Morrison had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The courthouse was immediately sealed. Federal agents searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Chicago police cordoned off the surrounding blocks. FBI investigators interviewed every person who had been in the building. The search continued for 72 hours, but found no trace of the judge who had just sentenced Al Capone to die. The most baffling aspect of Morrison's disappearance wasn't just that he had vanished from a secure building. It was that the security footage showed Morrison entering his chambers at 3 p.m., but never showed him leaving. The window was 12 stories above street level, making escape impossible. The door was monitored by guards who swore no one had passed through. Judge Harold Morrison had simply ceased to exist. April 20th, 1934, 3 days after Morrison's disappearance. Al Capone's death sentence was automatically suspended pending the appointment of a new judge to oversee the case. Federal authorities began the process of finding another judge willing to take over what had become the most dangerous judicial assignment in American history. But every judge approached by federal prosecutors declined the case. Word had spread throughout the judicial community that Al Capone possessed capabilities that went beyond anything they had encountered in their legal careers. The message was clear. Judges who sentenced Al Capone to death didn't just risk their careers, they risked their existence. It's unprecedented. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover told his agents during an emergency meeting, "We can't find a single federal judge willing to preside over the Capone case. They're all convinced that Morrison's disappearance was Capone's doing, but Capone was in shackles, surrounded by guards, with no way to communicate with anyone." What the FBI didn't understand was that Al had spent months positioning his assets throughout the courthouse system. Morrison's disappearance hadn't required any communication from Al during the trial. It had been set in motion months earlier, with contingency plans for every possible sentence Morrison might impose. May 15th, 1934, 4 weeks after Morrison's disappearance, federal authorities made a discovery that would haunt the American legal system for decades. Patricia Williams, the physician treating Morrison's wife, confessed to FBI agents that she had been working for Al Capone's organization for over a year. Morrison never knew, Dr. Williams explained during her interrogation. Every person he trusted, every person he relied on for security and information, was feeding intelligence to Capone's network. By the time Morrison sentenced Capone to death, he was completely surrounded by Capone's people. "What happened to Judge Morrison?" the FBI agent asked. Dr. Williams stared at her hands for several minutes before answering. Judge Morrison learned something that shattered his confidence in his own judgment. He realized that his death sentence wasn't based on justice, it was based on evidence that Capone had allowed him to see. When Morrison understood that he had been manipulated into condemning a man who had orchestrated his own trial, he couldn't live with the knowledge that he was no longer capable of determining truth from deception. "Where is he?" "Judge Morrison is alive," Dr. Williams said quietly. "But he's no longer Judge Morrison. He's a broken man who will never again trust his ability to distinguish justice from manipulation. Capone didn't kill him. He did something worse. He destroyed Morrison's belief in his own judgment." June 30th, 1934, 11 weeks after Morrison's disappearance. Harold Morrison was found living under an assumed name in a small town in Oregon, working as a bookkeeper and showing no recognition of his former life. Medical examination revealed no physical injury or evidence of coercion, but Morrison's mind had retreated so completely from his judicial identity that he appeared to have no memory of ever being a judge. When FBI agents tried to question him about Al Capone, Morrison's only response was to repeat the same phrase over and over, "I can't tell the difference anymore. I can't tell what's true and what's manipulation." Morrison spent the remaining 18 years of his life in that Oregon town, never again practicing law, never again making judgments about truth and falsehood, justice and injustice. He had become a man so fundamentally broken by the realization of his own fallibility that he could no longer function in any role that required moral certainty. Al Capone's death sentence was quietly commuted to life imprisonment by federal authorities who understood that the American legal system had encountered something. It was not equipped to handle a criminal mind so sophisticated that it could turn the pursuit of justice into a weapon against justice itself. The psychological impact on the judicial community lasted for decades. Federal judges began implementing new security protocols, not just to protect their physical safety, but to protect their psychological integrity from criminals who might possess the capability to manipulate evidence and testimony so skillfully that honest judgments became impossible. Al Capone had proven that his power extended beyond the criminal underworld into the very heart of American legal system. He had demonstrated that a sufficiently intelligent criminal could not only evade justice, but could turn the pursuit of justice into a form of psychological warfare that destroyed the people attempting to enforce the law. And Judge Morrison's empty chambers became a legend within the federal courthouse system, a reminder that some enemies are too sophisticated to be defeated by conventional legal methods, and that the pursuit of justice sometimes requires more than just evidence, law, and moral certainty. April 17, 1934. A judge pronounced a death sentence. A man disappeared, and the American legal system learned that there are forms of power that exist beyond the reach of any law. If this incredible story of judicial manipulation amazed you, hit that subscribe button. We're revealing the Al Capone stories that show how intelligence and strategic planning can outmaneuver even the most powerful legal institutions. Drop a like if you think Al's psychological warfare was genius, and in the comments, what do you think really happened to Judge Morrison in those 30 minutes? Turn those notifications on, because next week we're uncovering the story of how Al Capone's final confrontation with the IRS became the battle that finally brought down America's most untouchable criminal. Remember, in the world of crime and justice, the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who break the law, they're the ones who understand the law well enough to turn it into a weapon against itself.